Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today we will be looking at the mainstream media's coverage, or mainly the Guardian and the Times coverage, of the ongoing COVID inquiry. Because, and I do mean this when you say it, you would not know what the main points of the inquiry are from some of the articles being put forward about the inquiry. So I don't see any reason to dilly-dally about, we may as well just get straight into it. First up we have the Guardian, and this was their coverage of the first day of the inquiry. 8 shocking revelations from Cummings and Kane at the COVID inquiry, from foul-mouthed rants about colleagues to appalling neglect of vulnerable people. Those close to Boris Johnson reveal workings of government at height of pandemic. Well, shall we see what the 8 most important things the Guardian thought came out of the first day of the COVID inquiry are? Boris Johnson suggested COVID is nature's way of dealing with old people. Sir Patrick Vallance, the UK government's chief scientific advisor during the pandemic, noted that Johnson favoured older people accepting their fate and letting the young get on with their lives. As the Prime Minister was resisting reimposing restrictions in December 2020, Vallance wrote, Johnson says he partly thinks the whole thing is pathetic and COVID is just nature's way of dealing with old people. I'm not entirely sure I disagree with them. And honestly, even I knew some older people who were saying that. They were thinking, look, I understand I'm more at risk because it is more risky for older people to get it. I can do what I need to do to protect myself. You can do what you need to do around me to protect me from the virus. You just go off and actually enjoy life. You actually go out, you actually work, you actually help the country keep running. But no, instead, the modelers and the scientists came out with all their worst case scenarios and therefore we had to lock down. I mean, The Spectator has actually been very, very good with this. Here are just 4 of the many graphs that they have kept from SAGE's modelling, which were the models that the government were mainly going off to predict what would happen under various scenarios. And you can see from absolutely every single graph on here, they massively overestimated all the peaks, all the hospitalizations, all the deaths, all the disasters that would happen if we didn't completely lock down and ban people from going outside apart from about an hour a day to get some exercise or do some shopping. They were the only 2 reasons you were legally allowed outside. And this was assuming that all people would follow the rules as well. I guarantee you, majority of people did not follow the rules to a T. And it's quite clear that the people in charge didn't believe this because most of them went out in number 10 Downing Street and a number of other government places to have social gatherings and parties. So it's quite clear that absolutely no one believed this model, but we had to completely ruin the country because of it. Our economy is in the bin because of all this, and my god, you look at educational attainment, you look at the results of GCSEs and all that, it's been a disaster. Something like a quarter of children can't read at the age of 11. That's just insane. And it's because COVID, all the lockdowns, because they couldn't go to school, and Skype lessons were no substitute for that. Their education has been completely destroyed because of it, so thanks, scientists. Next up, Dominic Cummings said vulnerable people were appallingly neglected. The Prime Minister's top advisor was asked about how much number 10 considered ethnic minority groups, domestic abuse victims, and others in the run-up to the imposing a national lockdown. Cummings said, I would say that the entire question was almost entirely appallingly neglected by the entire planning system. He added the Cabinet Office was essentially trying to block us creating a shielding plan. Because lockdown had to happen no matter what, because it was almost like a game between governments. The less deaths and less hospitalizations you had, the better you dealt with COVID, apparently. Well, okay, every country tried that, and now pretty much all of Europe is in economic turmoil, and America's scraping through, mainly thanks to the states that didn't completely lock down. So I'd say so far these first 2 points are pretty valid points. I can see why they would be on a list of 8 top things to put into your news report about this inquiry. Number 3, it gets a bit weird. Cummings frequently called for the sacking of Matt Hancock and other cabinet ministers. I mean, we already knew this. In May 2020, he warned Johnson about the health secretary. Hancock is unfit for this job. The incompetence, the constant lies, the obsession with media, BS, overdoing his job. Still no effing serious testing in care homes. His uselessness is still killing God knows how many people. By August 2020, Cummings told Johnson he was creating the perception that he was happy to have useless F-pigs in charge. He claimed Hancock was a proven liar, and he accused Simon Stevens, the chief executive of NHS England, of BSing. He also said Gavin Williamson's position as Education Secretary was not suitable after a U-turn over teacher-assessed exam grades. In other words, point 3 is a bit weird to me because It's almost like The Guardian are saying here that Cummings is wrong for pointing out that people are useless. There's something about the tone of this paragraph that says, oh, Cummings was calling all these cabinet ministers names and disagreed with them, and therefore he shouldn't be listened to and we should still hate him. But I'm going to be honest with you, I pretty much agree with everything Cummings said in that paragraph. He seems like a very sensible man, to be honest, and the one who really wants to get the government on the rails of actually governing and dealing with the problem properly. And there's 105 pages of Dominic Cummings' witness testimonies for this inquiry, and trust me, we're going to pick some highlights out of that a bit later, because as far as I'm concerned, although I have a few disagreements with Dominic Cummings' politics and his way of dealing with COVID, it was clear that he had very good intentions for the country. It is clear that he's the type of guy that does not work well in Parliament and the civil service because he actually wants to get useful things done. Hence, he wants to get rid of useless people. So yeah, third on the list, and things are getting a bit sketchy for The Guardian's coverage. But next one is even worse. Cummings used misogynistic language to denigrate the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, Helen McNamara. I'm not being funny, but already I have seen him call many other men names. I don't particularly care if he was misogynistic, I'm not going to lie here, because with The Guardian saying it's probably not true. He claimed McNamara's propriety and ethics team waste huge amounts of time. In a WhatsApp message to the number 10 communications director, Lee Kane, he said he would personally handcuff her and escort her from the building. He added, I don't care how it is done, but that woman must be out of her hair. We cannot keep dealing with this horrific meltdown of the British state while dodging stilettos from that C word. Cummings suggested moving McNamara to the Communities Department where she could build millions of lovely houses. Cummings denied his comments were misogynistic. I was much ruder about the men who told the inquiry, and that's true, but The Guardian still states as fact that he was misogynistic. And if misogynistic just means that you were a bit rude about a woman and said that a woman is useless, then I don't care, because he has done the same thing with men. He has been very rude to the men and said they are useless. He has not treated the woman any differently, aside from the stilettos comment. But this is all misogynistic ever means. No one cares what you say about men. No one cares if you make sexist remarks about men. No one cares how much you insult a man, as this shows. As soon as you make a comment about a woman being useless and throw an insult about her, you're misogynistic and therefore need to be out of government. I mean, this just shows all The Guardian are trying to do is do another hit piece on Dominic Cummings. That's all this article is. Despite the fact all this article is doing is making me want an absolute monarchy with Dominic Cummings somewhere on the council. Johnson urged Cummings to end orgy of narcissism. See what I mean by a hit piece on Cummings now. When Cummings was asked to leave Downing Street in November 2020, he complained to Johnson about briefings from those close to his then fiancée, Carrie Symonds. Johnson told him, you speak of briefings from Team Carrie. She hasn't briefed anyone, and my instructions to all were to shut the F up. The Prime Minister also accused Cummings of briefing that Symonds was shaping lockdown policy. He said, this is a totally disgusting orgy of narcissism by a government that should be solving the national crisis. We must end this. Which, again, all this seems to show is that Cummings really understood what the issues with the British state are and were at the time of COVID. It's pretty obvious that Carrie Symonds did have some influence, how much exactly we don't know, but some influence over how the government was run, and especially how the COVID lockdown policy went. Because for months, Boris Johnson was essentially just saying, wash your hands, that was the way to deal with COVID. And then all of a sudden, for some reason in March, he goes all the way to the other side and says, we're going to have a complete and utter lockdown. You won't be able to leave your home. Key workers keep working, but if you are not a key worker, then we'll give you some furlough money. It's a complete 180. It's a turn on a dime. It was absolutely crazy. And people just thought it was because Boris Johnson went into the ICU and then got scared. But really, the amount Dominic Cummings is bringing up Carrie Symonds, she was probably influencing quite a lot while Boris Johnson was ill. And naturally, Boris Johnson's reaction was just to defend his wife, or fiancée at the time, so no surprises there. But this is clearly just a hit piece on Cummings. That's all The Guardian are trying to do here. In fact, the last 3 points are so benign, I'm not even going to go through them properly. The first one is just saying that Dominic Cummings didn't care that he went to Durham Castle, and neither did anyone else with a life. And the last two are just the communications director of number 10 at the time. Lee Kane was against the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, where you'd get half price on a meal thanks to Rishi Sunak to help pubs try and get back into business. And he also thought it was a blunder to ignore Marcus Rashford's campaign and not pay parents to have their kids eat at school for free. really tedious stuff when it comes to covering the first day of the COVID inquiry. And really, what have you learned here? You've learned of very few predictable communications within number 10. Of course, it was highly stressful. Of course, people were being incredibly rude to each other. Everyone thought everyone else was useless. And we knew Boris Johnson wasn't a fan of lockdown in the first place. Again, it's just, oh, look how crass they were being. Yeah, this is pretty standard. In fact, I'd go as far as to saying this is exactly what I would expect from a cabinet office that has to deal with a pandemic. This is exactly what I would expect. People arguing with each other, calling each other names, and the people actually wanting to get things done, telling useless people to just go away. And even the next day, it gets a bit worse. Instead of just having a list of several points saying this is what we learned from today, The Guardian thought that it was important that everyone know Johnson asked scientists about special hairdryer to kill COVID, says Cummings. Like, yes, I'm sure stupid ideas were thrown out there too. Was it brought up in the inquiry? Yes. Does it deserve its entire news story? No, probably not. And neither does this part of the inquiry either. Lack of diversity in number 10 led to women's deaths in lockdown, COVID inquiry told. Helen McNamara says women become invisible overnight and criticise Johnson's failures to challenge misogynistic language. I'm not being funny, I would go as far as saying the whole point of the lockdown was to help women feel safe. Because naturally, men are just bigger risk takers. They would be happy to have no lockdown, risk getting the coof, but keep the country running to at least a minimum standard. Really, at the end of the day, all Helen McNamara is complaining about is the fact that she was called a C-word, and Dominic Cummings wanted her nowhere near the lockdown plans or the COVID response because, as he said, she was useless. And you know what? I can believe that because Dominic Cummings seems to understand how to get useful people into the government, as his push to get weirdos into the government showed. I mean, The Guardian hated it so much they had to do a hit piece on one of the useful people because he liked one of Dominic Cummings' articles discussing eugenics. Women died of domestic abuse during the first lockdown, partly because of a lack of diversity in number 10. What a ridiculous statement, honestly. The Guardian are just taking this woman's statements at face value. A former civil servant has said, criticising Boris Johnson for failing to challenge violent and misogynistic language used about her. That's an amazing two things to put in the first paragraph, by the way. Imagine juxtaposing women died during the lockdown due to domestic abuse and not being able to access the help they need. Oh, and also, Dominic Cummings said that I throw stilettos. The juxtaposition of the very serious problem with the who cares you got called a few names is genuinely something to behold. I mean, it's amazing. No wonder Dominic Cummings thought you were useless. Helen McNamara was giving evidence to the COVID-19 inquiry a day after an appearance by Dominic Cummings, Johnson's former top aide, who was asked about messages in which he said number 10 was dodging stilettos from that C word. McNamara, who served as Deputy Cabinet Secretary and was one of the country's highest-ranking female officials, told the inquiry the way in which it was considered appropriate to describe what should happen to me, yes, a woman, but yes, a civil servant. It is disappointing to me that the Prime Minister didn't pick him up on the use of some of that violent and misogynistic language. I'm genuinely at a point, I'm radicalised to a point where if anyone says anything like this, if they are complaining about being called names, and if they are complaining about reactions like this in very high-stress situations, just get them out. They're not useful. They're just trying to blackmail you. They are just trying to say, I'm going to go to the media and say that you called me names. Because this is really what's happening. Yes, at a COVID inquiry, but I'm not being funny. This isn't the only place. The Guardian isn't the only place where this is happening. I mean, just look at the Times' front page. Several stories on the front page. Their main headlines, obviously, are right at the top there. There is only one thing about the COVID inquiry, and it is an opinion piece on saying, is Helen McNamara a heroine or is she a villain? Well, I'm on her side. I think she's a heroine. All we're finding out about her so far is that she wasn't particularly happy about being called a C word. That's literally all we know so far. And the only other, by the way, COVID inquiry article on the front page here, and it's in the secondary articles, is pretty much saying the same thing. Bullish Boys Club of number 10 thought we'd sail through the COVID crisis. I'm not being funny, but from Dominic Cummings and what he's saying, it doesn't appear that way. It doesn't appear they'd sail through it. It appears that they were just useless and idiots all throughout the cabinet. And quite clearly, Dominic Cummings was the one saying, look, I only want useful people here, because useful people are going to get things done and actually save lives. But the fact we've come out of this and a load of people have died from COVID, by the way, and all the inquiry can actually establish so far is that basically the people that have come out of it hate men. That's all we've established so far. At least that's the case if you listen to the mainstream media. And I mean, let's just have a quick look at what this heroine or villain article has to say. Who is that woman who appeared poised, articulate and reassuring in her houndstooth suit and sharp bob, hands folded in her lap? What a ridiculous starting statement. When the BBC's Laura Kusenberg interviewed the key players in British politics for State of Chaos, a three-part documentary about the seismic events of the past decade, Helen McNamara stood out as a star, while ministers, permanent secretaries and advisors look increasingly like a trolley park at Tesco on a rainy Saturday morning, manic and unhinged as they talked first about Brexit, then the pandemic and Partygate. The former Deputy Cabinet Secretary remained calm, rhetorical and analytical. I mean, this is just ridiculous fawning for the one woman so far that's come out of this whole inquiry. Here finally you felt was a grown-up and a professional, a civil servant who was trying to do her job under increasingly strained conditions as Downing Street veered from one Prime Minister to the next. Why wasn't she running the country when rumours first began about a virus in China? Well, I don't know. Probably because, as Cummings said, she was genuinely useless. Shall we have a look at some of her witness testimony? I think she has some interesting things to say. Looking back, it is clear that the Cabinet Office moved up gears more slowly than the pace of the crisis. Government is a juggernaut. It has a unique scale of staff and processes, even compared to other big organisations. Yes, it is very bloated and bureaucratic, I do agree. The Cabinet Office since 2010 has become a juggernaut in and of itself too. This is one legitimate issue raised by Dominic Cummings. He wanted a quicker, more effective nerve centre. Broadly speaking, there were 3 gears in relation to responding to COVID-19. And you can pause and read them on screen there if you wish. But at least she admits that the government is over hiring people, is too full of civil servants and basically can't get anything done. She agrees with Dominic Cummings there. Now, have you seen any of this in any of the mainstream media? Have you seen any agreement between Cummings and McNamara? No, you'd think they disagree on absolutely everything the way they're being talked about. But the next paragraph is even more interesting. One of the challenges was recognising the need to shift up another gear and then get a machine with momentum in one mode to actually manage to do that. We were too slow to move at every point. In early March, it felt like the crisis accelerated exponentially and the system was always operating in too low a gear. In the first shift, from Cobra to CO+, there was no time to plan and prepare for the non-existent third gear. All the focus was on sprinting to catch up with where we should have been. This was made harder than it was also important to not look like it was the case given the importance of maintaining public confidence. Looking back, I think it might have been better to share more widely with Whitehall how bad it looked to us. Other senior leaders may have been better placed to help more, although I never wanted to undermine the Cabinet Secretary. I mean, this is huge news to me. This should be all over every headline, as far as I'm concerned. Instead of going on about, oh, Dominic Cummings called a woman a C-word, we should be hearing that the government had absolutely no plan, was working far too slowly, and that the communications between Whitehall and the Cabinet Office were completely lacklustre because both wanted to make it out to the public that they knew what they were doing, when in reality, as pretty much everyone knew anyway, neither of them did and were both working far too slowly. Do you know that from anything you have seen from the headline news? No, all you know is that you should hate Dominic Cummings. But I think what is also worth pointing out in all this is that McNamara seems completely aware that the government was being completely useless, and she was doing absolutely nothing to help the situation. It gets worse, by the way. In the course of preparing for the inquiry, I've gone back through my records from the time in so far as I can. I think in early March I was focused on trying to fix the problems I could see rather than illuminating them for others, so I was hesitant about giving Dominic Cummings further ammunition about inadequacies in the Cabinet Office or DHSC or other problems. She refused to tell Dominic Cummings, the direct advisor to the Prime Minister, just refused to tell him everything he needed to know, especially about how departments were struggling, because they didn't want to give him quote-unquote ammunition. This is pure corruption, by the way. This is McNamara admitting that she is corrupt. She is not being fully transparent, let alone with the public, but with others colleagues of hers, while during this public health crisis, because she doesn't want to give Dominic Cummings an advantage, because effectively, I imagine, she knew that he wanted her gone. It was very challenging throughout to get people to focus on what we could do at the time to make things better rather than critiquing other people or commentating on how bad it was that we were in the situation. Like, yeah, they're all useless, we get it. My strong view at the time was that although it was useful to continue to learn lessons about what we were doing, and I repeatedly and deliberately made the space to do so, it was less help to try and redraw the whole of the operating model or create a state of permanent revolution or blame everyone else. At the same time, I absolutely agreed that the crisis had showed up a lot of structural problems that need fixing. There were things to change and reorganise, but reorganising during an emergency comes at disproportionate cost and should be done precisely and sparingly, not rushed and often. I mean, that last sentence, fair enough. The rest of it, you would not know that you have civil servants saying that the civil service is bloated and cannot work based off the mainstream media talking about this. They can only fawn over this woman who was completely corrupt, not telling other civil servants the problems that she and other departments were facing, and all because she doesn't want to give people who don't like the civil service ammunition. Well, guess what? You've just given them ammunition, but the media is completely on your side, because the media seems to know that the civil service wants what the media wants, and it's probably because they're all intertwined. They all have the same cultures. They are all part of the new elite. That's why all they can focus on is how rude Dominic Cummings was about a woman and then call him misogynistic, because they don't care. They want the civil service in charge. They want Parliament out the way, because unfortunately, democracy to some extent is still working. The House of Commons is stopping this tyranny of these absolutely useless aristocrats. That's essentially what we're finding out here. So if you want a bit of a white pill, Voting Reform UK might actually help, because the Tories are part of this issue. The Tories are the ones that have overseen the civil service get even more bloated than it was under Blair. They have been the ones that have expanded the size of the civil service massively for little other reason than it's a job creation scheme and it gets people off the unemployment statistics. But this is absurd. These are some telling paragraphs. They tell you an awful lot about how bloated, bad and completely inefficient the British state is, and all we find out about is how Dominic Cummings is rude. It's insane. This point is exacerbated, by the way, further down. Having improved from the weeks from early March, it became obvious through April that the confidence Number 10 had in the machinery in the Cabinet Office was in sharp decline. They were increasingly questioning about the performance of the DHSC and the Health Secretary, where the issue was a lack of confidence that what he said was happening was actually happening. The two were related in that perceived problems with DHSC and the assurances that had been given also contributed to a lack of confidence that any of the accountability or governance structure were picking this up. The usual system of governance in Whitehall relied on people being truthful. There was chatter from the rest of Whitehall that was critical of the way the Cabinet Office was operating and criticisms of the Cabinet Secretary, and I was getting other signs that there was not sufficient clarity. Just to put that in much simpler words, the Cabinet Office stopped trusting the civil service because they were not being truthful to them. And we actually have evidence that they weren't being truthful to them because McNamara decided to, in her witness statement, say that they were not being truthful because they didn't want to give Dominic Cummings ammunition. But if you think the worst bit to come out of this witness testimony is that the civil service lied to the Cabinet Office, no, it gets much worse. We have here a civil servant who happens to then admit this. The second and related issue was that modern government is not really in charge of the country. There is not a great machinery that Number 10 sits atop of with large levers to pull. The state is more of a constellation of institutions and different and sometimes conflicting centres of power. The NHS and local government perhaps more so than most in terms of the relationship with the centre of Whitehall. So even if there had been an appetite to actually run the country, and there was from some and at times, Dominic Cummings, it was hard to see how that could be made to happen, and it definitely was not possible to run the country in a command and control way in any meaningful sense. That there was even an appetite for doing so I found surprising given my prior experiences of working for Conservative administrations who had acted in disperse rather than centralise the power of the state. In other words, the government does not control the government. Parliament is not in control of the country. What it is instead is all the different departments of the civil service. It is the permanent private secretaries running the country. It is the bosses of the NHS running the country. Even local councils have ridiculous power. And to be honest, the way we can barely build any houses throughout the country, makes me think that, yeah, that is probably actually true. The way HS2 has had to be stopped due to council powers being way too powerful and stopping this big infrastructure project, yeah, I can see why they'd say that. And I'm not even necessarily in favour of HS2. I'm in favour of large infrastructure projects, but my god, do they need to be private. But you're never going to have that because while the government will want that, the government, especially conservative governments, won't particularly care if it's privately or publicly done. They're not going to do anything about making it easier to build these things. And that's probably why you still have diversity officers all over the civil service and all over the NHS. This is probably why councils are actually allowed to stop James Dyson, for example, from funding a £6 million science centre for a primary school where he used to live. Because we live in a complete clown country run by people who are complete clowns and who every consecutive government that has come in since Blair has been completely fine looking over to the civil service and saying, yeah, that's fine. We'll keep these subversive institutions running, and in fact, let's make them bigger. This is one of the biggest revelations of this witness testimony. Do we see it anywhere in the mainstream media? Do we see anyone, even the pro-Cummings ones, such as the Express or the Sun, reading into this, finding this paragraph and saying, look, the civil service are saying that they are in charge of the country. That is what they are saying. No, apparently it takes someone like me to read through this and report it. A complete nobody, essentially, with less than 8,000 subscribers, finding this and letting you know, look, there are people in charge here, they actually know what they're doing. And they do not have your interests at heart whatsoever. They care more about looking good in front of their colleagues and getting your tax money. That's all that is on their agenda, because they have absolutely no problems in life as far as we're concerned. They don't have real problems. And so they make ones up, such as being called a C word and crying that it's misogyny, that they have suffered a hate crime. As far as I'm concerned, these people deserve to lose their jobs and quite frankly be destitute. Because they clearly hold my and my family and my friend's life in just as much contempt. And it's not just McNamara's witness testimony that has very interesting snippets. Dominic Cummings has some interesting ones too. On the 10th of March, Neil Ferguson emailed Ben saying deaths look like peaking at 4,000 to 6,000 per day. Lockdown could be worse than the disease and might be unsustainable. The worst outcome would be to continue with Plan A, which was herd immunity, or B, U-turn in the middle of a crisis. So if the current plan and the death toll are unacceptable, then act in a few weeks. So for those who don't quite remember, that was Chief Man who was making the models, claiming that we desperately needed a lockdown, effectively saying that, oh, actually, the lockdown might be way worse than the 6,000 deaths a day. Like, that's how bad lockdown might have been. We might have seen more than 6,000 deaths a day at the peak of lockdown. And even admitted that the worst thing to do would be to U-turn in the middle of a crisis. He admits that the best thing to do is just carry on with Plan A, and then in a few weeks, if it doesn't look like it's going well, that's when you U-turn. And of course, the government did the exact opposite. They did the worst case scenario in this place. All because Neil Ferguson, literally 11 days before lockdown was introduced, or it might even have been a week before lockdown was introduced, said that lockdown may be way worse than the disease. And U-turning in a week would be terrible. Possibly because during that week, he was really pushing for lockdown because he needed his models to actually have done something useful. And it turned out doing something useful was influencing the government to make a grave mistake with lockdown. Of course, does any of this come up in court, or does this come up in the mainstream media? Of course it doesn't. Because all we care about is Dominic Cummings calling people names. Because we have a clown media. Oh, and also Dominic Cummings in his witness testimony explains exactly why McNamara was being completely useless. The Deputy Cabinet Secretary, Helen McNamara, walked in and said, as per my memory, I have just been talking to the official, Mark Sweeney, who is in charge of coordinating with the Department for Health. He said, I've been told for years that there's a whole plan for this, but there is no plan. We are in huge trouble. I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all that I think we are absolutely effed. I think this country is heading for a disaster. I think we are going to kill thousands of people. As soon as I've been told this, I've come through to see you. So Helen McNamara will keep from the Cabinet Office that departments are struggling. Well, especially not to give details on how departments are struggling. The only detail she will give is that the other departments think that this government's useless. That's all she's giving them. It's not helpful. No wonder Dominic Cummings said that he wants her out the building, because she is clearly keeping things from him, and not only that, the things she is telling him are completely and utterly useless. Like, yeah, everyone knows this. Everyone knows that we think the country is screwed, because yes, you are correct. There is no plan, but we're doing our best and you are not being helpful in this regard. Go away. Another detail from Dominic Cummings' testimony is that after they inputted the plan to have lockdown and then release for summers and then lockdown again for winters until a vaccine came along, turns out that was the original plan from the start, which to be honest is a pretty decent gamble, I'd say, within the parameters that they were working with. About a week before they were actually going to implement the lockdown, this happened. On the 16th of March, I got an email from Claire Brunton in which she said that the Cabinet Office, CCS, had still not seen departmental plans for the pandemic, never mind evaluated and fixed them. Apparently departments hold their own detailed civil contingency plans, as well as their business continuity plan. We do not have these centrally. The NHS also hold their own plans. CCS is working with DHSC to get appropriate sight of these. This was another terrible sign fundamental things were broken. How could CCS have not seen departmental pandemic plans by a week before we were planning to have lockdown? Ben Warner replied, does this mean that the Department of Health hadn't seen the NHS plans yet? That number 10 needed to ask such questions at this stage shows how, as we probed, the situation seemed worse and worse. If CCS hadn't asked for and got such plans 10 weeks after COVID became news, what else that everybody assumed must have happened might not have happened? Bear in mind at this time, the data system for NHS updates to the Prime Minister was me dragging the whiteboard in and scribbling tables like one of the whiteboards above as Stephen spoke. CCS could not provide any real-time data. In other words, we have a really weird system in the UK where we have a really, really centralised tax system in which majorities, over 70% of our taxes, go to the government, and then what the government does is that it distributes it out to all these different departments to budget and run their departments. And in return for these budgets, they get absolutely nothing. They don't get any control. It's one of the weirdest systems in the world, and then when you get to a disaster and a pandemic like this, it turns out that they don't have a fundamental central plan for this. Each department is supposed to have their own, but clearly from this it shows that they didn't have an original plan, and they were really dragging their feet to get the plan in action and reviewed, and they clearly weren't keen to let number 10 see any of their plans. And in fact, it got so bad that they don't even have real-time data, and even when they did get the data, Dominic Cummings had to do really approximate drawings on a whiteboard. And the communications problem is no joke, by the way. When COVID struck, Simon Stevens would read out the latest NHS data from a scrap of paper with numbers phoned and faxed in. Yeah, they weren't emailed, they weren't even sent by letter, there was no centralised kind of dashboard for them to look at or anything like that, no. They had to come in from every single department, and some were even faxed in. I have worked in offices for over a decade at this point. I have never in my life actually even seen a fax machine. Why does one of the biggest governments in the world still use fax machines? Because of our very low testing capacity, the most reliable information came from people showing up at hospitals and or dying. The NHS, DHSC and the Cabinet Office had data systems many years out of date. NHSD was seen as terrible. This had a huge effect on the quality of decisions. Not only that, you also have bad data, because obviously if people were dying of COVID in hospitals, they didn't have to die because of the COVID. If they simply had it, that counted as a COVID death. So your numbers were skewed up anyway, and that's probably why absolutely every single model we saw was wildly overestimating the issue. Even when private companies started making their own models based off the same data, they still had overestimated the problem, but it was way closer to the actual recorded data that we saw, weeks later when we could actually get the data. So there you go. If there's one thing that you should take away from this more than anything, it's the fact that our government is completely useless, doesn't have a plan for any serious issue that we might end up having, whether it's nuclear war, whether it's a pandemic. They clearly don't have a plan. And as we have seen for years, the day-to-day plans for how to fix the country, either they do have a lot of talk and don't actually do anything about trying to fix the country, or they are actively working against you, because at the end of the day, Parliament aren't on your side, and even if they were, they couldn't do anything anyway, as we have seen. And the worst part about all that is that the mainstream media are completely on the civil services side. They will constantly be on their side because they are filled up of these same types of people, these new elites, these Russell Group graduates who only managed to get jobs in London because their mums and dads paid their rent until they ended up somewhere like BBC Verify, or in a position where they weren't telling private advisors to the Prime Minister important details about the pandemic and the response to it. So with that in mind, I think I'm going to finish this video off with a Dominic Cummings tweet. Why is the mainstream political media so bad? Last 48 hours, you can see roughly 99% of big shot political hacks can't even be bothered to read the statements given to the inquiry, which is the opposite of this channel. I have bothered to read it. All they cover is the theatre, often posing from lawyers rather than detail. Just like they cover the BS of cabinet, but not how power is actually exercised by officials, more powerful than ministers who just read scripts like NPCs. Same on Iraq, 2008, COVID, Ukraine, and same now on terror in the Middle East. They never change. But we're in a transition to a new media ecosystem where they are rapidly shrinking relevance. And hopefully my relevance will increase inversely to their shrinking relevance. And you can help with that by subscribing, liking, commenting, becoming a channel member, just supporting the channel in any way you can. Naturally, I would greatly appreciate it. But yes, the mainstream media are shrinking in relevance, and it's because of stupid things like this. Everything we've read here, it's just people in the cabinet were being mean to each other. Yeah, great. I get that. I get people are mean to each other in high-stress situations. I don't care. Let's look at really what went wrong. And what went wrong in this situation is that Parliament is not only over-bloated, and not even Parliament, the government, Whitehall, civil service, whatever, it's all over-bloated, it's all massively bureaucratic. They've tried to decentralise power, and all it's ended up doing is essentially centralising a culture that is hugely against the interests of the British commoner. And not only are they against the interests of the British commoner, they are also completely incapable of doing anything. It's the worst of both worlds. They are very low trust in that, well, you can trust that they will be against everything a high trust society needs, i.e. the British people want, and they are also very low performance. They can't do anything right. I actually find it amazing that lockdown went off as well as it did, but I guess that's what happens when you have an overzealous police force that gets out drones to spy on people walking their dogs in the Peak District. So yeah, I can completely understand why Dominic Cummings is as irritated as he is. But I will be keeping my eye on this COVID inquiry, seeing how the mainstream media are telling us absolutely nothing important about it, and reading through the documents to see if any other huge bombshells come out. But at the end of this, I don't think an awful lot is going to happen. You might see a court of public opinion trial on Dominic Cummings, which has been happening for the past 5 years or so, but I'm pretty sure he's used to that at this point. Will anything improve? Of course it won't. We're in the clown decade, and we're not quite at the getting better stage yet. So, I will leave you with that. And once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.